Hey everybody, welcome back to the I Believe podcast. I'm joined today with Dr. Marlana Orloff from Thomas Jefferson. We're so glad to have you back, Dr. Orloff. Thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely.
Okay, so guys, today we're talking about something that's a little bit, maybe a little bit uncertain in the uveal melanoma metastatic world. It kind of feels a little bit like there's a little bit of a clinical trial drought. So Dr. Orloff, can you just kind of talk to us about like what's going on right now, and should we be worried? Should we, where should we be keeping our focus as metastatic patients?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, any cancer, any disease really that, relies heavily on clinical trials for pushing the field forward, it can feel like there's peaks and valleys, ebbs and flows. You could at some point in time have, a dozen or more really great clinical trials, all different lines of, therapy, previously treated, treatment naive, for uveal melanoma specifically, HLA-A2 positive, negative. And then all of a sudden it feels like there's very few. It's really, I think right now we're kind of coming down off of what I would consider probably a high. And, I think a lot of patients are kind of asking questions like, okay, well, what's out there for me? What should I be doing? What should I be thinking about? So I thought we would use this time. I have a short presentation just to kind of talk about maybe some of the things that have just wrapped up. That are kind of no longer available right now, but then also trials that are available, and then maybe what's coming down the pike. Okay. So
yeah, let's go ahead and share your screen.
Yes, let's do this. So the real question is, are we in a clinical trials drought? So, I think, again, as I mentioned, I think for a while, it was raining, the rivers were high, and now we're feeling kind of as some trials have wrapped up and the water has receded, are we in a drought? So as I mentioned, I just wanted to start out by kind of wrapping up, or talking about the trials that have maybe since wrapped up. And maybe given a little bit of insight about where things are headed. So I think one of the biggest trials that has since wrapped up was really a multi-pronged trial. Here I'm showing kind of the study design for the randomized trial, which was the frontline trial for A2 negative patients, looking at drugs darovasertib and crizotinib. So that's the PKC inhibitor and the MET inhibitor, and these were targeted therapies. And if you're not a stranger to this podcast or keeping an eye on things all going in uveal melanoma, you've heard about this trial for a number of years. Perhaps you even participated in it. And this was the randomized trial that really is an effort to get this drug potentially approved. So it was pure first line A2 negative because the A2 positive patients have tebentafusp versus investigator choice, which was widely pretty much immune checkpoint inhibitor therapy. And so this trial enrolled very quickly and has since completed again, hopefully leading to kind of an accelerated type approval. At the same time this trial was open, there was also kind of the earlier trial that allowed patients who were previously treated and actually even allowed A2 positive patients. So what was recently presented back in October was actually the first reported overall survival of this combination as part of kind of that original trial we call Optimum 01. So again, just wanted to kind of highlight, because this is the most data that's out there. There will be more data coming out for Optimum 02, which was the randomized trial that just finished, but that will be a little bit more post ASCO. So, again, this is kind of some pretty, high-level data. This is part of the presentation at SMR. But, again, here you can see that these drugs are really targeting that mutation that we commonly see in uveal melanoma, the GNAQ, GNA11. And the important thing with this trial was that it was really the trial that also established dose of the darovasertib 300 milligrams BID plus crizotinib 200 milligrams BID. And so what this trial was really looking at is a subset of patients that were treated in that earlier trial. And here you can see just in 41 patients, overall response rate 34%. A lot of patients having partial and stable disease, and we call a disease control rate of about 90%. So that's really having a response or stable disease. And duration of response, you can see there about 9 months. So again, this was very positive data. I think we're hoping that the subsequent randomized data will fully show this. Some of that data has since been released and looks pretty good. But again, so again, this trial wrapping up. Right now, a lot of patients are like, okay, great, the data is fantastic. Can I get these drugs? And the truth is not right now. So, with the randomized trial wrapped up, the O1 kind of backfill cohort trial closed, these drugs are not really available yet for patients with metastatic disease. So we're kind of in this weird in-between period, which we've experienced before, even with tebentafusp, where we have a positive trial. Drug looks, potentially good, but we're still waiting potentially now for approval to be able to get patients access to it. So my hope is just that it's coming. So another trial that, wasn't necessarily kind of a global trial, but something that did wrap up was the Chopin trial. So this was kind of the long-awaited readout of the comparison, again, randomized, of PHP alone versus kind of PHP sandwiched with Ipi-Nivo. And there were early signs that this was potentially a really important or effective approach with just a few patients treated and presented a number of years ago. But this was the first randomized trial, and you could see good numbers in the arms, 38 in each arm. And what we're seeing here is that the combination group, so again, that sandwich approach, had a much improved PFS, 1-year PFS and median PFS, as well as an improved potentially 2-year overall survival. 1-year overall survival still a bit similar with an improved median OS. So again, this is single center, hasn't necessarily been replicated kind of globally, but it was randomized. And the different thing about this data coming out that looks good and positive and potentially promising compared to the Daro-Criz is that because PHP and Ipi-Nivo are already approved therapies, it's not like we're in this holding pattern until this necessarily gets approved. So a lot of patients, if they're eligible for PHP, if they're eligible for Ipi-Nivo, are now getting what we call the Chopin kind of style approach, or the Chopin combo, as kind of standard of care now. So, again, even though the trial is wrapped up, these are therapies that are an option for patients. And though this is just a little bit more about the overall response and the safety. So another trial that was enrolling pretty quickly here, especially in the U.S., was the trial of rogolisibep, or ROGI for short, which is a PI3 kinase inhibitor. The trial was patients who were previously treated, so it really met an unmet need for us in the space, whereas patients could have progressed on prior liver-directed, could have progressed on prior Tebi, could have progressed on prior Daro-Criz, and then all they had to get on this trial was prior essentially immunotherapy exposure, because the thought is that this drug rogolisibep can kind of like reinvigorate the immune system that might have already seen an immunotherapy. And this was randomized to essentially anything. You could have randomized to what we called investigator choice, which could have included, best alternative care, which could have been just supportive therapy, other immunotherapies, potentially even liver-directed therapy. And this trial has since now closed. So the difference about this trial and say the Daro-Criz trial was that this trial wasn't necessarily powered to get approval, say, for rogolisibep. This was really more of like a signal seeking, like, do we move forward to try to, do a larger study to try to, see what happens next. But we'll see. Sometimes even small trials can get the attention and get things approved and whatnot. But I think we'll wait to see this data. This data may then launch into another trial that may bring, this drug as an option. And this is just the way that the trial was designed. So, again, I think even though some of these kind of important fully enrolled, trials that were, enrolling a lot of patients have closed, there are still options, and I would argue to say that if we're feeling like we're in a bit of a drought, that I think the rain is coming. And so let's see. My animation didn't work. There we go. But it is. I think the rain is coming. So, Again, I think also when we're feeling like we might be in a clinical trials drought, we do still have plenty of standard of care options. Obviously we're always still looking for kind of the next best, but, patients who are A2 positive, there's tebentafusp, there's all the liver-directed therapies, there's things like ablation and histotripsy, there's radiation, there's still the immune checkpoint inhibitors. So there are still a variety of standard of care options. There are also trials that are still open. So this is the RP2 plus Nivo trial, which is a randomized trial of an approach that I've talked about, I think, on here actually before, which is a modified virus that's injected directly into the tumor. And this is in combination with Nivo, and this is essentially versus Ipi-Nivo. And so this trial really came out of prior experience with this in uveal melanoma, small numbers of patients, but here you can see there's patients who had their tumors injected that responded, and even tumors that weren't injected in the liver that responded. And these were also patients in that group that actually progressed on prior immunotherapy. But this trial, that again is still open enrolling, is metastatic uveal. You can't have had prior immune checkpoint. So you can't have had prior Ipi-Nivo or Opdualag or anything like that, because that's basically what the trial is randomized to. So, and you can't have had more than one prior line. So essentially what this allows is prior tebentafusp or prior really daro-criz. The only other thing that I would say, though, that's a little kind of unique about this trial is that there are some cutoffs when it comes to liver function, as well as number of kind of organ sites outside the liver. So there can't be more than kind of 2 other organ systems affected by the melanoma outside the liver. So there is a little bit of nuance. And there's also a limit on % liver involvement, can't have more than half the liver involved. So there is a bit more kind of nuance on this trial to be eligible. But, again, someone coming right off of Tebi, certainly this could be an option. But say you've previously had the Chopin trial, or the Chopin approach, you would not be eligible. One, because you've now had also low bar full liver directed therapy, which is not allowed necessarily, and you've also previously had Ipi-Nivo. So again, just, you folks have probably heard me talk about this before. I think when you start at square one, it's always important to kind of understand what option A, B, C, D might be, so that if you're really hoping to do option C, you make sure that option A or B won't then exclude C. And so I think that's something that you really have to think about if you're considering the RP2 trial, just because of some of those inclusion-exclusion criteria. The other trial that is enrolling, though I think because of the nature of being a phase 1 study, it's a little bit tricky to get maybe a slot, and I think the future of subsequent studies is still a little TBD, but hoping that there'll be a subsequent phase 2 study, is the NovelWise or NBM-BMX. So this is a type of HDAC inhibitor, HDAC8 specifically, single agent in the phase 1, obviously still trying to explore dose. And then like most phase 1s, this is nice because there's no really limit to prior therapy, so it can have previously been treated with a variety of different things. Again, this is open, few sites in the US, but only a few slots. Normally there's only like 3 or so slots per dose cohort. Can take a little while to enroll, but there hopefully will be a future trial that will then enroll more patients. And then I just put this slide up here. This happens to be our kind of institutional tebentafusp plus trial. This one we're, exploring the combination of tebentafusp and liver-directed therapy, specifically immunoembolization up front. But there's actually a lot of sites around U.S. and abroad that are looking at tebentafusp plus. So whether that's tebentafusp plus something like a cytokine like IL-2 or tebentafusp plus another type of liver-directed therapy such as PHP. So kind of now combination of therapies that we already have approved as standard of care. And I would definitely encourage folks to kind of investigate those trials to see if they're eligible, because sometimes it's nice to kind of do this combination or sequence approach. Because I think there, as the Chopin trial has showed us, there's possible synergy between these systemic and liver-directed therapies. So I think definitely stay tuned to discussion post ASCO. I think that may be where some of the rain is in the forecast. So I think there's going to be a number of trials being discussed at ASCO. Many smaller trials that are going to have maybe abstracts presented may lend themselves to larger trials in the upcoming months. This includes things like TIL, things like that radio kind of ligand therapy, MC1R. Other combinations, certainly treatment in the adjuvant and neoadjuvant setting, other abstracts if you've already perused what's going to potentially happen at ASCO, also some interesting things about modes of surveillance. But, I would still say, and I know the community feels this, that there's still a large unmet need for these 2+ second line plus trials, right? You've had a prior liver directed, you've had a prior TEBI, now what? You've had prior Daro-Criz, maybe you also have had TEBI, now what? I think when it comes to trials right now, we're definitely, not, there's not a whole lot for patients who've had a lot of prior therapy. And while we have some effective therapies that are really improving patients' survival, I think, none of these yet, for the most part, are really a home run, right? We're not curing, folks yet. So I think really having something, beyond that second line for patients who are still feeling well, liver function's good, still a really large unmet need. And I know that's where a lot of us researchers and physicians are really trying to, push to get options for patients. So, there's my animation again. So with that, I will end my presentation.
Dr. Orloff, thank you so much. I feel like this helps kind of put things in perspective and really just shows, what happened, right? We've got trials that they didn't close because they're not effective. They closed for gathering data and to be able to move to the next step. And that's huge in our community because that's the only way we get something like tebentafusp or the Hepzato PHP approach. That's the only way that those things happen is when the trial closes and then we get the data that says, hey, let's get approved.
Yeah, and I know, I feel like, though that waiting period, can feel like forever, right? If you're a patient waiting for something, like that waiting period, I get it. I wish I could push a, fast forward button, but unfortunately it takes a bit. So
yeah,
we are in that there now though. Yeah.
So while we are in this kind of waiting period, you mentioned focusing on those standard of care options. So let's just kind of run through, just discuss those. Outside of trials, which I know you mentioned the couple of enrolling trials that are still there, but outside of trials, what do we have to focus on if we're in the metastatic community? Because I know, myself, I'm metastatic. I know there's plenty of people who might be listening who you guys are also metastatic. So where should we be keeping our focus in the standard of care?
So I think some of it's going to depend on what you've already had. So if you've not previously had Ipi/Nivo, for instance, and you're a candidate for liver-directed therapy, then certainly exploring, the Chopin style approach, which was that kind of PHP Ipi/Nivo sandwich sequence, I think is definitely something that patients should consider. I do think a little bit of the tricky part is if you really look at the trial, it was essentially in patients who were previously untreated. So I think there is some uncertainty in knowing how someone's going to benefit from that approach. Say if they've already had tebentafusp, or they've already had Daro-Criz and tebentafusp, or they've already had Y90, because I think that the trial was more so in kind of a patient population who had significant treatment before. But I think it's still worth a shot, specifically if you're eligible for PHP and previously had not had checkpoint. I think what we really don't know is if you did have checkpoint, is it worth it to combine the checkpoint again with PHP, right? Say you were on the Daro-Criz trial or even the RP2 trial and you got randomized to the Ipi/Nivo arm and you had a couple of doses and maybe progressed. Is it worth it to try the Ipi/Nivo again with the PHP if you're going to go down that road? I think we don't know that.
Yeah.
So,
I don't know, from I guess the place that I think of the Chopin approach from, just the theory maybe behind it that obviously we can't prove for sure, but the theory behind it that I like to kind of live in as a patient is this idea that Hepzato or the PHP helps to sort of wake up the immune system to what's what's there, because dying cells become more available to the immune system. And then in theory, it could make the immune therapy a little bit more likely to pick up on it.
Yeah, yeah. So for exactly, or it somehow clears out the bad immune cells. So there's these things called Tregs that maybe live in the liver. Yeah, exactly. So in that case, if we kind of just go on that theory, then yeah, maybe reintroducing ipi-nivo after PHP may have more benefit than, somehow the PHP resensitizing someone,
Yeah, absolutely.
to the immunotherapy. So, I think it's a harder probably conversation if you had tox with that ipi-nivo back, whenever you got it.
Yeah.
But, again, that's a conversation to have.
So, what's your opinion generally, like just as an oncologist who's been in this space for a long time? What's your opinion on ipi-nivo? Because I feel like in the community, there's kind of this general myth that's existed that like, oh, ipi-nivo is terrible. We never want to do ipi-nivo. But I've talked to oncologists who are like, well, we can manage the side effects. Like, what's your kind of, I guess, your judgment call on how to
Yeah,
balance
so
that?
I wish we had something better. I mean, listen, ipi-nivo and skin melanoma, like, obviously it's been amazing for patients. I think in uveal, I think there's real sometimes hesitation just because we know the response rates aren't fantastic, but it still has all the tox. And the tox can become life threatening. The tox can prevent you from getting other things. But I think the hard part is that there are some patients who respond. And we have some clues on maybe who that could be. But generally, I don't think we are fairly confident in predicting who's going to actually get a response from ipi-nivo. But there's definitely patients who do. So if you got, if you don't have any other better option, and certainly if someone's progressing with disease outside the liver and for which, you can't do liver-directed therapy, then I think ipi-nivo is an option, because there are some patients who do respond. And yes, we can manage the side effects, though sometimes obviously they're not very fun, and some can be pretty hard to manage. But yeah, I don't love it. I wish it was better. I wish, it wasn't as toxic. I wish it had a bit better of a response rate, but we definitely do use it. I would say with all of the clinical trials that we have with ipi-nivo as the comparator arm, or now with the Chopin style approach, I would try to, if you're going to expose yourself to ipi-nivo, I would do so kind of either in a trial setting, or in the PHP combo setting, so you're not doing it just to do it, So it's sometimes unfortunate, if a patient has already had ipi-nivo as first line just because, then they come to us and they're not eligible for either the RP2 trial, or you're hesitant to do the PHP ipi-nivo thing, or when Daro-Criz was available, then they're not eligible for that. So, again, kind of, and it's hard to go backwards, but certainly if you're a patient with new diagnosis, just at least having consultation somewhere, to make sure that there's nothing else you should be doing first line, as to not, burn a bridge. So
Yeah. So, what about like just liver-directed therapies outside of PHP? Where do you feel like those live in this kind of space of this waiting, between all the trials and what's going to be coming?
yeah, so obviously a lot of you folks know at our institution we still do a lot of liver-directed therapy, whether it's immunoembolization, either on that trial with tebentafusp or by itself, chemoembolization, so that's chemotherapy but embolizing, so not the perfusion like in PHP, Y90 radioembolization still an option. So these are definitely all still options, certainly for patients with liver-only, liver-dominant disease, patients who maybe there's not a clinical trial that makes sense, patients who don't want a systemic therapy for, whatever reason, or certainly the chemo-embo, I would say the place that we're using it a lot is even if someone does have extrahepatic disease, if someone's coming in with pretty bulky or rapidly growing tumors in the liver, and maybe it's going to take a minute to get PHP set up, or ipi-nivo set up, or they're not eligible for PHP, we can use chemoembo, because we can do that pretty quickly. Like, normally we see a patient, we can do within a week or so, as kind of a stopgap to try to kind of hold things, so then you have a minute to breathe, and then kind of say, okay, is there a trial? Is there another approach we want to be taking, or time to get things set up?
Yeah, absolutely. Are you, I mean, I guess it really just depends on where somebody is in the metastatic journey. But like, if you have somebody who shows up and they've got, new metastatic diagnosis, maybe one or two liver lesions, like, are you looking at like IE or CE more, or are you looking more at like maybe ablation or surgical? Like, where do you feel like those other options fit in?
Yeah, so I think so. You're right. So I think a patient who presents with very limited disease, I think in some ways these are sometimes the harder patients, right? Because maybe you have all the options on the table. Maybe RP2's on the table, PHP, Ipi-Nivo's on the table, immunoembo's on the table. Heck, if it's just one or two tumors, yeah, things like ablation could be on the table. So, in those cases, we kind of hash it all out, right? So again, you've probably heard me talk about this, but kind of my decision tree. So, knowing HLA. So again, patients who have very limited disease who are A2 positive, certainly things like tebentafusp on a clinical trial or by itself, can make sense. We would normally do immunoembo if we were going to reach for a liver-directed therapy, if we're really just talking about one or two tumors, very limited disease. The way that we think about ablation or histotripsy, rarely surgery, is patients who've really declared themselves as having truly slow-growing kind of oligometastatic disease. So we like to see maybe a couple MRIs showing no other tumors, because you don't want to put somebody through an ablation or histotripsy and then your scan a month or two later, there's 5 more tumors. So, often if we have a patient who maybe we've been following this like 7 millimeter thing, and then it's 8 millimeters, then we biopsy it, and then we get another scan and it's 1.2 centimeters, we will ablate that.
It still doesn't have friends.
It still doesn't have friends. We'll ablate that. I think we feel very comfortable ablating something like that. The thing though to remember is that things like ablation, surgery, and histotripsy, there are some trials that consider that a line of therapy. And so, do you want to do this, potentially short-term, very directed therapy that could buy you a period of time of no treatment? Or do you just want to go right on to potentially a trial or another treatment because, if you do the ablation, then you can't. So again, these are all things that certainly come up in conversation, and you always wish you have a crystal ball, but I haven't found a crystal ball yet. So you kind of, use your experience, your judgment, discussion with the patients, an understanding of hopefully what's out there, what's to come, to hopefully make the right choice.
Yeah, well, and I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that we have this big discussion. Do you feel like you have that discussion, like first and foremost, just mostly with the patient, or do you guys have at Jefferson, like I just know that some areas, like some of the regional centers, like the bigger centers, they have like a tumor board, or they have like a large group of doctors that they all get together and they look at the scans and they go like, oh my gosh, what are we looking at here? Yep. So how do you guys typically approach like a new metastatic or just like a progressing metastatic patient?
Yeah. So we have a tumor board every Monday morning where we review all the patients that we're going to see in clinic that day, as well as then probably 20 or 30 or more other patients who we're following their scans. And certainly if it's a new patient referred to us or it's a patient that has new progression, exactly. Our tumor board's really radiology driven. So, MRIs of livers, CAT scans, up on the screen. IR's present, med-oncs present, sometimes radiation oncology is present, our research coordinators are present, and we hash it out. And sometimes there's, agreement between all parties, and sometimes people have different thoughts. And ultimately we take that conversation to the patient. So then we also see patients together. So then med-onc and IR will actually see patients together in the same room at the same time that same day, if it's a patient being seen that day. And we'll kind of rehash what our group discussed. And, oftentimes we come out of that meeting saying like, okay, I think we're going to recommend A, if the patient's feeling a certain way about it, B or C are totally also reasonable, or we only recommend A, and these are the reasons why we wouldn't do B or C. And essentially then we take that conversation into clinic with the patients and go from there.
Yeah, no, I love it. I think it's so interesting to hear like this kind of, it's such a collaborative approach. And I think that it allows room for those kind of out of the box options to become part of the discussion, or just the creativity of medical care, especially in uveal melanoma. Like I feel like it's one of the challenges, but it's also, I think, one of the cool things that we get to witness, that you guys do as doctors. So I love that.
Yeah.
What about KIMTRAC? I know like we just got some data about KIMTRAC, and that's obviously only for HLA-A*02:01 positive patients. But where do you live now on KIMTRAC now that we've got a little bit more of that overall survival data to go on?
Yeah, so for those listening that may not know all the data, but so the original trial read out, then there was a 3-year overall survival follow-up, and then most recently, I think at AACR, there's the 5-year overall survival follow-up, and I think it's pretty similar to what we've been experiencing, now that we've been using the drug for a while. There does seems to be a subset of patients who just have a very prolonged, benefit from the drug and survival. I think what you kind of see kind of in that group are patients who've either had prior TEBI and are now on something else and still having good survival, or there's actually patients that are still on TEBI for just a really long time. We've certainly had patients who've been on now 5, 6 plus years, on weekly tebentafusp therapy. Some of them have gotten other things sprinkled in over time. So I think that is the nice thing about TEBI, is that because there's so few side effects kind of beyond those first few doses, if someone maybe has a mixed response, a couple years in, or something new pop up, you can radiate it, you can ablate it, you can do liver-directed therapy, and you can kind of keep TEBI on in the background. I think going back to the, early days of TEBI, obviously it was a huge deal to have a drug approved. I think we were hopeful maybe it was going to have more of a response rate, but it seems like even without having that, big response rate up front, there's patients who clearly continue to derive benefit. So we still use a lot of it, either by itself or, like I said, in combination. Again, only for the A2 positive patients, but it's definitely certainly something that we use. And again, to just let everybody know that if they're thinking about tebentafusp, to potentially look around or ask about these trials that are popping up in a couple places where it's kind of TEBI plus something, because I think that's potentially going to move the needle a little more forward.
Oh, I love that. Okay, well, overall, I feel like we've covered a lot, you guys who are listening. I know we covered a lot, so please feel free, go back, and I should have said this at the beginning, but if you've been tuning in on the podcast and you haven't actually been able to, watch the slides, head over to the YouTube channel, because we do have the slides up on the YouTube channel. But this has been really helpful just to break it down and to kind of see the benefit of where we're at right now in the uveal space. And I think overall my takeaway here is that even with standard of care, one of the big benefits that we always talk about is that this gives us some more time, right? Using standard of care options is going to give metastatic patients time, and time means time for the rain to fall, as you said.
Yes, I feel like we need to insert the Hillary Duff song or whatever.
Oh my God, yes.
But yes, there's a lot. I think there's a Lady Gaga song about rain. But yeah, no, I feel it. I feel it. I know, patients are, in need of more things, and just to know that we're working on it. And like I said, I would tune in post ASCO, for potentially some new things coming down the pike.
Okay, so post ASCO, that's where you think we should kind of keep our focus going into the summer, and these research, obviously we've had I think AACR just happened, right? Mm-hmm. So we've got AACR that just happened, and just, keep that in mind that as we go into the summer, we here at A Cure Insight, we've got the ION Research Convention that we will do. It's just that seminar that's virtual, and we're going to kind of pull together all the important pieces from AACR and ASCO, of course, coming up at the end of the month in May and June. So, I mean, there's obviously going to be some announcements and some data, and so, keep an eye out for that, literally, in some cases. I feel like that's my, token joke. I have one eye, so I'm I'm going to keep an eye out. I'm oh, wait, the only one I have. But yeah, and I think it is a Hillary Duff song, the "Let the Rain Fall, I'm Coming."
Yep.
I love her music. I grew up listening to all of her music, and I'm going to see her in concert.
Yeah, she's back.
Mm-hmm. I'm so excited.
Yeah.
So excited. But thank you guys for listening. Thanks for tuning in. If you're one of our subscribers on our YouTube channel or the podcast, we couldn't do this without our listeners. So make sure to just drop in the comments if you have questions. Tell us a little about your story, and definitely reach out if you have big questions to contact@acureinsight.org, and we'll make sure to connect you with, whether it's through our physician finder with doctors close to you that you can get opinions from, or just to help make sure that we can get your questions answered. And let's see, lastly, we're going to just wrap with thanking our sponsors. We could not do the podcast without our sponsors, Delcath Systems, IDEA Biosciences, Castle Biosciences, and Aura Biosciences, all of whom help to contribute and make sure that this podcast keeps running, that our YouTube channel keeps running, and that we can keep bringing you guys content every week. And then I guess most importantly, Dr. Orloff, we just got to thank you for being here and for just, I feel like you always do such a good job of like putting things out there in a really clear, concise way that I feel like just keeps us focused on the right things. So thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
All right, you guys, we will see you next time. Make sure to subscribe, and we will talk to you later.
Bye.